Hey guys, tonight we'll venture into a place hidden by mist and memory, nestled within rolling hills where whispers echo across the trees. It's a place that, for 12 years, was home to unspeakable horrors, the Whispering Pines Resort. Over this time, the stories of families disappearing without a trace became too frequent to ignore. Every disappearance more puzzling, more chilling than the last. The idyllic resort, with its peaceful cabins and serene landscape, was a sanctuary for vacationers, a retreat from the pressures of life. But for some, it became their final destination. What happened to these families? Was it an accident? A series of unfortunate coincidences? Or something far darker? As we dig deeper into the eerie events surrounding Whispering Pines, we'll uncover the untold stories of families who were never seen again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to hear where you're watching from, and what time it is in your neck of the woods. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Whispering Pines Resort wasn't always a place of fear. When it was first established in 1980, it was a popular getaway destination. Nestled in the heart of the Colorado Rockies, surrounded by dense pine forests and tranquil lakes, the resort had everything one could want: cozy cabins, hiking trails, fishing, and a rustic charm that seemed straight out of a postcard. Visitors would flock from all over the country to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, seeking rest and renewal in the peaceful mountain retreat. But as the years went on, something started to feel off about the place. What was once known for its warmth and welcome slowly became a location of whispers and rumours. Locals began talking, and soon, stories about families who vanished mysteriously at the resort started to spread. It all began with the Smith family, who were the first to disappear. The first disappearance was one that nobody could have predicted. It was a sunny afternoon in the summer of 1985 when the Smith family checked into the Whispering Pines Resort. Mark and Elaine Smith, along with their two young children, Sarah and Jason, had been looking forward to their week-long escape from the chaotic demands of daily life. They had heard the glowing reviews, read about the peaceful hikes and the scenic beauty that awaited them, and couldn't wait to unwind in the idyllic surroundings. But it wasn't long before their stay took a strange turn. 2 days into their vacation, the family's cabin was found abandoned. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Their luggage was still packed neatly in the corner, their shoes by the door, and the children's toys scattered across the floor. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the table, untouched, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment and never returned. The staff and nearby guests were initially confused, thinking perhaps the family had decided to leave early for some reason. But when they failed to check out and no one could track them down, the local authorities were notified. What they discovered sent chills through the small mountain town. There were no footprints leading away from the cabin, no sign that anyone had even walked outside. It was as if the Smiths had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but their belongings. The investigation into the disappearance went nowhere. The local police had no leads, and despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, no trace of the Smith family was ever found. Weeks went by, then months, but nothing was uncovered. Rumours began to swirl about the resort. Was it haunted? Had the family encountered something sinister? As the mystery deepened, so did the feeling that something malevolent had taken root in the resort. But it wasn't until the next disappearance that the pattern became undeniable. Months passed after the disappearance of the Smith family, but the unsettling silence that followed did little to quell the unease in the surrounding community. By the time the next disappearance occurred, the small town of Willow Springs was already on edge. People whispered about the strange events at Whispering Pines Resort, but those who continued to visit chalked it up to coincidence until the Harrell family vanished. The Harrells were from out of state, a couple with 2 teenage children, eager to experience the same retreat that had attracted the Smiths. They arrived at Whispering Pines in the spring of 1986 with high hopes of spending a quiet week away from the stresses of city life. They were greeted warmly by the resort's staff, and everything seemed perfect at first. They were settled into their cabin, the picturesque landscape of pine trees and mountain peaks just outside the window. But as days passed, the air began to thicken with tension. On the 4th day of their stay, the Harrells went out for a hike, a trail that promised scenic views and a peaceful escape from the resort's eerie rumours. They never returned. It wasn't until a resort employee went to check on them the next morning that the disturbing truth came to light. Their cabin, like the Smiths before it, was found untouched, no signs of disturbance, no struggle. The family's belongings remained in place, their shoes by the door, a stack of magazines on the coffee table, a television still softly humming in the background. It was as if the family had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. But much like before, there were no footprints in the snow outside and no sign of their departure. They had vanished. The authorities were once again called in, and another investigation ensued. This time, however, the town couldn't ignore the undeniable connection between the 2 disappearances. The Smiths and the Harrells, 2 families in a span of a year, both gone without a trace, both seemingly swallowed by the very earth beneath the resort. It was impossible not to speculate what was going on at Whispering Pines. Some began to wonder if it was all coincidence, perhaps a tragic, unfortunate string of events. But as the disappearances continued, the rumours began to spiral. Local legends resurfaced, stories of a curse tied to the land long before the resort was even a thought. These rumours grew louder, fueled by the strange, unexplainable events surrounding the disappearances, as the resort's reputation began to take a hit. One thing was clear: the more the town resisted talking about it, the more mysterious the disappearances became. No one wanted to confront what was really happening in the woods surrounding Whispering Pines, but the pattern was forming. Families came for a peaceful retreat, but they never left. And soon, it wasn't just whispers, it was fear. The stories surrounding Whispering Pines grew more outlandish with each new disappearance. It wasn't long before local legends resurfaced, tales passed down through generations, murmured among the residents of Willow Springs in hushed tones. The woods themselves, some said, were cursed by the spirits of those who had died long before the resort was even established. Elders spoke of an ancient pact made with the land, a pact meant to keep the land fertile, the trees strong, and the waters clear, but at a terrible price. They called it the Pact of the Pines. The legend went something like this: many years before the resort's construction, a group of settlers arrived in the area, hoping to build a life on the untouched land. The indigenous tribes that lived there warned them this land was sacred, a place where the spirits of the past still roamed, where the forces of nature were beyond understanding. But the settlers, driven by greed and ambition, ignored the warnings. They built their homes, cleared the forests, and took what they wanted from the land. Soon after, strange things began to happen. The settlers reported hearing whispers in the wind, voices calling from the trees, and eerie shadows moving across the mountains at night. But the most unsettling occurrences were the disappearance of settlers who wandered into the woods, only to never return. Their bodies were never found, and their families were left to mourn in silence. Some claimed the spirits were angry at the intrusion. Others said it was the land itself, hungry for blood and willing to take whatever was offered. Whatever the truth was, the settlers had ignored the warnings, and many believed that the spirits had demanded retribution. The resort's construction in the 1980s, some locals argued, had only reopened old wounds. When the Smiths disappeared, they said, the spirits were simply reclaiming what had been taken from them. The pattern continued with the Harrells, and the rumours only intensified. People began to question the place's very foundation. What if the land was cursed? What if something truly dark was drawing people into the woods, taking them one by one? And it wasn't just the locals who were whispering these stories. Visitors who'd come to the resort also began to feel the strange unease in the air. Some described hearing strange noises at night, like faint voices carried by the wind, or feeling as though they were being watched, even when they were alone. Others claimed that the trees themselves seemed to move, their branches creaking and groaning, bending toward the cabins in a way that made people feel trapped. A few guests even reported seeing shadows darting through the forest, flickers of movement just outside their peripheral vision. But when they looked, nothing was there. It was as though the entire resort had become a place of haunting, where the natural world and something darker, something ancient, collided. The resort's serene beauty, its clear waters, lush forests, and towering pines belied the malice that many believed lurked beneath. Some visitors left early, refusing to return, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The staff, too, seemed uneasy. There were whispers that they knew more than they let on, that they understood the power of the land and feared what was being awakened. As the years passed, more and more families came to Whispering Pines, drawn by its peaceful reputation, only to vanish without a trace. The resort, now infamous for its connection to the disappearances, became an eerie symbol of something sinister, something lurking just beneath the surface. But the more the town ignored the growing number of strange occurrences, the more disturbing the truth became. And it was only a matter of time before someone would dig deeper, someone who wasn't afraid to uncover the resort's buried secrets. As the disappearances continued, the pressure to investigate what was happening at Whispering Pines grew undeniable. The local authorities, having been unable to make any substantial progress on their own, finally decided to bring in outside help. In 1988, a team of investigators was sent to the resort. This team, however, was different, comprised of experienced detectives, forensic experts, and an anthropologist specializing in indigenous folklore. They were determined to uncover the truth behind the resort's dark history. Their task wasn't just to investigate the disappearances, they were there to examine the land itself, to look for any clues that might explain the string of disturbing events. The team arrived with high hopes, eager to delve into what they assumed would be a straightforward investigation. At first, their observations seemed to mirror what the locals had said. The resort was too pristine, the air too still, and the silence too heavy. The atmosphere felt off. The investigators spent the first few days conducting interviews with the staff and guests, but they couldn't seem to find anyone who had anything concrete to offer. The employees all spoke highly of the resort, even though their eyes occasionally darted nervously when the subject of the disappearances came up. One by one, they interviewed those who had visited the resort over the past decade, but the answers they received were vague and confusing. Many claimed to have seen things, strange figures in the woods, unexplainable noises at night, but no one had any real evidence. The investigators began to realize that the staff and guests alike were either afraid to speak the truth or didn't know what they were dealing with. It wasn't until they examined the surrounding forest that things began to take a darker turn. The team of experts had a hunch that the land itself might hold the key to understanding what was going on, so they focused their efforts on combing through the woods surrounding the resort. What they found was unsettling. The trees, they discovered, seemed unnaturally dense, their trunks twisted in strange shapes that gave off an eerie feeling. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as if something invisible was weighing down on the land. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they found more signs of the land's ominous history. Old, overgrown markings carved into tree bark, faded symbols that resembled rituals, and stones arranged in circular patterns that looked like ancient graves. It was as if the very earth was holding secrets, long-forgotten rites performed under the cover of darkness. Still, they found no trace of the families that had gone missing. The investigators decided to look into the history of the land itself. They uncovered that the region had been inhabited long before the settlers arrived, and the indigenous people who lived there spoke of the land's power, the power to trap souls, to swallow the living whole. Their stories were filled with warnings about the forest, about how the trees could become sentient, aware of the trespassers who dared to walk upon them. The investigators were struck by a chilling thought. What if the families weren't simply vanishing? What if they were being pulled into the forest, their fates sealed by something much older and darker than any human could understand? It wasn't long before strange things began happening to the investigative team. Equipment malfunctioned for no reason. Maps would be found torn or erased, and some of the team members began experiencing vivid dreams of the missing families, trapped in an endless maze of trees, their eyes pleading for help. One member of the team, an experienced anthropologist named Dr. Sylvia Grace, began suffering from extreme bouts of paranoia. She'd wake in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was watching her from the windows of her cabin. But when she would look, there was nothing there. Despite these growing fears, the team continued their investigation, but it was clear that something was actively trying to keep them from uncovering the truth. The more they dug, the more obstacles they encountered, some of which couldn't be explained by mere human interference. It was as if the land itself was fighting back, determined to keep its secrets hidden. And so, as the investigation wore on, the unsettling question remained: was there something supernatural at work here, or was there a human hand manipulating the situation from the shadows? The deeper the investigators went into the mystery, the more they began to suspect that neither explanation could fully account for the horrifying events unfolding at Whispering Pines. By the time the investigation was officially called off in 1990, they had learned little more than they had in the beginning. The team returned home with their reports, but their findings were inconclusive. No evidence of foul play, no concrete leads, no answers. The official statement was that the disappearances were simply the result of tragic, random circumstances, nothing more. But for those who lived in Willow Springs, the truth was far from simple. They knew something had been left unsaid, something hidden beneath the surface of the resort's polished exterior. As the resort continued to operate, albeit with dwindling numbers of visitors, the mystery of the missing families remained unresolved. It wasn't until much later that someone else would attempt to uncover the truth, the same truth that had eluded the investigators and frightened the locals for years. By the time the official investigation had fizzled out, many thought the mystery of Whispering Pines had been buried. But as with any unresolved tragedy, the story never truly dies, it only waits, lurking until someone is brave enough to unearth it again. That someone came in 1993, a man named Benjamin Waters. He was a recluse, an enigmatic figure in the world of true crime investigations. Known for his obsession with unsolved disappearances, Waters had heard whispers about the resort for years, about the eerie disappearances that had become the subject of dark folklore. What piqued his interest wasn't just the mystery of the vanishing families, it was the fact that no one had ever come back to truly examine the land itself. The initial investigators had been driven away by strange occurrences. But Waters wasn't so easily deterred. He arrived in Willow Springs with a reputation for unorthodox methods. Waters was no ordinary investigator. He often used unconventional techniques, psychometry, a practice where one tries to uncover hidden truths by handling personal objects from the vanished, and even hypnosis, believing it could unlock repressed memories. To some, he was a genius. To others, a madman. But he was determined to uncover the truth behind the disappearances, regardless of the costs. He set up camp near the resort, living in a small rented cabin just outside the property. He began by interviewing locals and researching the area's history, speaking to anyone who would listen, particularly the older residents who still clung to the old stories. It didn't take long for Waters to uncover more unsettling details. He learned that, in addition to the disappearances, there were other oddities surrounding the resort: strange noises in the woods, inexplicable phenomena, and a deep sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. especially on stormy nights. His investigation took a more personal turn when he met the resort's caretaker, a man named Claude Reddick. Claude was an odd character, short, wiry, with a perpetually nervous demeanour. He had worked at Whispering Pines since the early days of its opening and was one of the few employees who had remained despite the growing rumours and strange occurrences. Waters felt something was off about Claude. The man's eyes darted nervously when he spoke, and there was a coldness to his voice that seemed out of place in such a picturesque setting. Claude was reluctant to speak at first, but over time, Waters managed to break through his shell, using a combination of psychological pressure and patience. One evening, as the two sat in a quiet corner of the resort's small bar, Claude finally confessed something that set Waters' nerves on edge. He spoke of an old, unspoken tradition that had been passed down among the staff for decades. It was a tradition the higher-ups at the resort had tried to hide something that involved the land itself. Claude whispered about an ancient ritual, a pact that was made long before the resort ever existed. It was a dark, forbidden practice that required sacrifices to keep the land alive, to maintain its power, its fertility. The ritual had been forgotten by most, lost in the annals of time, but some of the older staff still remembered it, passed down through cryptic, hushed words. Claude explained that every so often, a gift needed to be offered to the land, and that gift had to be fresh, pure, an innocent something that would satisfy whatever dark force lingered beneath the earth. The families who disappeared were not random. They had been chosen by the land itself. The victims were drawn to the resort for reasons that couldn't be explained. And once there, they were pulled into the depths of the forest, never to return. Waters felt the blood drain from his face as he listened. Could it be true? Could this curse, this blood-soaked tradition, still be alive? Buried beneath the modern-day resort, his mind raced. He needed to know more. Claude, however, was visibly shaken by his own revelations. He pleaded with Waters to stop digging, to leave it alone. He warned that those who got too close to the truth were never heard from again. But it was too late. Waters was already on a path he couldn't turn back from. The next few days saw an increase in strange occurrences around Waters. His equipment began malfunctioning, documents went missing, and he started experiencing vivid dreams of being chased through the woods by something relentless, something unseen. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was always watching him. The tension in the air grew thick, as if the land itself was pressing in on him, trying to force him into submission, but Waters didn't retreat. He spent the next several weeks in the forest, searching for any clue that might explain what had happened to the missing families. It wasn't until one night, when a storm had rolled in, that he finally found something that would change everything. He had followed a trail deep into the heart of the forest, a trail that he felt, almost instinctively, was leading him toward the truth. The rain poured down in torrents, the wind howling in his ears, but Waters pressed on, and then he saw at a clearing, a massive stone structure partially hidden by the trees, covered in moss and vines. It was ancient, older than the resort itself, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light. Waters approached the structure cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, the air grew unnervingly still. Then, as if by some unseen force, the ground beneath him shifted. The stones seemed to move, and the symbols glowed faintly, as if alive. He stepped forward, and that's when the forest seemed to close in around him. The last thing Waters heard was the wind picking up, howling in his ears like a warning. And then, all went silent. The next morning, the authorities found his cabin empty. His equipment was left behind, the notes he'd taken scattered across the table, as though he had left in a hurry. No trace of Benjamin Waters was ever found. The land had claimed him, Just as it had claimed the others, Benjamin Waters' disappearance sent shockwaves through Willow Springs. The authorities had already been on edge for years, and now, with Waters' sudden vanishing, the mystery of Whispering Pines Resort was no longer just a series of disappearances, it was a riddle that defied all logical explanation. His last known location, deep in the forest near that ancient stone structure, only served to deepen the mystery. His research and the strange symbols he had uncovered remained untouched in his cabin, as if he had been taken in the middle of a discovery that would have unravelled the truth once and for all. Despite the fears that had long haunted the town, the local authorities had no real answers. What began as a concern over the disappearances of a few families had grown into something far darker, more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. As more time passed without a resolution, many of the locals began to suspect that the resort's connection to these tragedies was no mere coincidence. It was a place where visitors weren't just escaping from their everyday lives, they were walking into a trap. What made matters worse was the sudden quiet that followed Waters' disappearance. The media, which had once been so interested in the mystery of the vanishing families, quickly lost interest. Perhaps the events at Whispering Pines had become too unsettling for the public to stomach. Maybe it was the lack of answers, the ever-growing list of questions, that pushed the world to look away. But not everyone was content to leave the story unfinished. There were whispers, rumours, and unofficial investigations, especially from those who knew Benjamin Waters' history. One such person was Isabel Hughes, a reporter from a nearby city who had been following the story from the beginning. Isabel had been deeply intrigued by the case, seeing it as a unique opportunity to break a major story. However, the deeper she dug, the more she uncovered a trail of oddities, strange files buried in archives, hushed conversations in dark alleys, and a group of former resort employees who spoke of things they would never dare repeat in public. Isabel's persistence brought her to an old local historian named Thomas Finch. Finch was a relic of the town, a man who had lived through nearly every generation of Willow Springs. His memory was sharp, though his health was failing. When Isabel approached him about Whispering Pines, he immediately warned her to stop asking questions, saying, "Some things, girl, should stay buried." But as with everyone who had come into contact with the resort's mysteries, Isabel couldn't leave it alone. Her instincts told her there was more to the story, and Finch was just the person who could provide the key. Over a long and tense conversation, Finch reluctantly began to divulge pieces of information. He spoke of the early settlers who had arrived in the area, and how they had been warned by the indigenous tribes to leave the land untouched. They thought they could tame it, Finch said, his voice raspy with age. But the land doesn't want to be tamed. It wasn't always like this. But it's been hungry for as long as I can remember. According to Finch, the settlers' ancestors had been the first to conduct a ritual that involved the land, a pact of sorts, designed to make the area flourish. It was an ancient form of symbiosis between the settlers and the earth. However, this symbiosis was perverted by greed, and the cost was far greater than they realised. The price for prosperity was paid in blood, and it was a debt that had been passed down through generations. The land claims what it's owed, and it doesn't care who pays, Finch muttered, as if reliving an old nightmare. Isabel's mind raced as Finch's words settled in. The land itself was more than just a backdrop for these disappearances. It was the active participant in the horrors that had befallen the resort. The ancient pact, which once kept the settlers safe, now demanded a steady supply of gifts, innocent souls, drawn into the woods, never to return. This ritual was not just a relic of the past, it was still being practiced, albeit in secret, by the resort's management. The disappearances were not random, they were sacrifices, part of an ongoing, twisted tradition. But the more Isabel learned, the more she realised how dangerous her pursuit was becoming. The moment she began to ask the right questions, the town's attitude toward her shifted. The whispers started again this time. They were about her. People who had once been kind and open suddenly avoided her gaze. She felt eyes on her wherever she went. She was being watched. Undeterred, Isabel continued her investigation. But soon, things began to take a more personal turn. One evening, as she returned to her rented cabin after a long day of research, she found a note slipped under her door. The message was brief, written in a hurried scrawl. "You've been warned. Leave now, or the land will take you too." She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The note was clear. Someone or something was telling her to stop digging. Isabel knew then that she was too deep into the mystery, too close to the truth. But it was too late to back down. What had started as a journalistic inquiry had become a battle for survival. Isabel's next steps were carefully calculated. She needed to get inside the resort, to see for herself what lay beyond its pristine surface. Armed with her newfound knowledge, Isabel broke into Whispering Pines one dark, moonless night. She managed to sneak past the security measures and entered the resort's deepest, most secluded part, the maintenance area that no guest was ever supposed to see. What she found there would haunt her forever. The maintenance area of Whispering Pines Resort was a forgotten place, an underbelly that most guests never saw and most staff avoided. The hallways were narrow and suffocating, lined with aging pipes and decaying equipment. There was a stale, musty smell that seemed to cling to the walls, a scent of neglect and time. Isabel crept silently through the halls, the low hum of the resort's generators providing a backdrop to her own heartbeat. She had no idea what she would find, but her instincts screamed at her to keep going. The deeper she ventured into the labyrinthine corridors, the more isolated she felt. The lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the walls, creating a sense that the resort itself was alive, breathing. As she rounded a corner, her flashlight caught something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A door, slightly ajar, beyond which the air felt colder, heavier. Inside, Isabel's breath caught in her throat, and the room beyond the door was nothing like the rest of the resort. It looked ancient, almost like it belonged to a different era. The walls were lined with shelves full of old, dusty books, strange artifacts, and what appeared to be ritualistic tools, ceremonial daggers, carved wooden idols, and jars filled with substances Isabel couldn't identify. The room was dominated by a large, circular table at its centre, its surface covered in worn symbols that looked similar to the ones Waters had uncovered in his research. On the walls, barely visible in the dim light, were faded maps of the surrounding forest, marked with X's in places that seemed deliberately significant. These were no ordinary maps, they were part of something much larger. A web of locations where sacrifices had occurred. The air in the room felt thick, almost oppressive, as if it were holding its breath. Isabel's eyes scanned the room, her mind racing with the realization that she was standing in the heart of the ritual. This was where the disappearances were orchestrated, where the sinister pact with the land was still being honoured. But as she reached for her notebook to jot down what she had found, a sound behind her froze her in place, a creak. The unmistakable sound of a door slowly opening. Isabel spun around, her flashlight flickering once more, revealing the figure standing in the doorway. It was Claude Reddick, the resort's caretaker, his pale face illuminated by the weak light. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were cold, hard eyes that betrayed nothing but a deep, abiding fear. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a hoarse whisper, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm raging outside. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Claude? What is this? What's really happening here? Why are families disappearing?" Claude stepped into the room, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking slightly. This isn't just about the land, Isabel. This is something much older, something we can't control. It's a force that has been here long before any of us, and it demands its tribute. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. Isabel's eyes widened. So you know about the sacrifices? You've been part of it all along. Claude's face twisted, as though struggling with the weight of a decision he had been avoiding for years. He nodded slowly, his hands trembling. I'm not the one in charge. I'm just the one who makes sure things go according to plan. The families, the ones who disappear, they're never random. They've always been chosen. They've always been the land's gift. Isabel felt her legs grow weak, her stomach churning as the truth slowly sank in. So it's true. The land takes them. The curse is real. Claude's eyes filled with tears. It's not a curse. It's an ancient covenant, a contract we can't break. The land gives us life, prosperity, and peace in exchange for the blood it demands. Those families, they didn't just vanish. They were part of the deal. You're the first person who's gotten close enough to understand. But you don't know how dangerous this is. Isabel's mind spun as she struggled to process what Claude was telling her. She could barely catch her breath. But there has to be a way to stop it. There has to be a way to free everyone who's been taken. Claude shook his head, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world had collapsed onto him. You can't fight it. The land is too old, too powerful. The only way to stop it would be to destroy it, but that would cost us everything. The land would take back what it gave, and Willow Springs would be gone. There's no escaping it now. Isabel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The horror that had been unfolding at Whispering Pines was more deeply rooted than she had ever imagined. The land itself wasn't just haunted, it was alive, aware, and hungry. The real question now wasn't just whether she could escape, it was whether anyone ever could. And just as Isabel opened her mouth to ask Claude what could possibly be done, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned, and for the first time, she saw them, the shadows of the missing families. Faint, translucent forms, standing just inside the doorway. Their faces were hollow, their eyes pleading. They were trapped. Isabel's blood ran cold as the realization hit her with full force. She wasn't just uncovering a mystery. She was standing at the heart of an ancient ritual, one that claimed more lives than anyone could have imagined. And now, it seemed, she was the one who'd been chosen. Before she could even react, the shadows surged toward her, their hollow eyes locking with hers. The land had claimed another victim. The shadows closed in on Isabel, their figures moving with an eerie fluidity, as though they were not entirely bound by the laws of the physical world. Their eyes, hollow and filled with an endless, silent sorrow, locked onto hers. The air around her thickened, as if it too were drawn into the gravity of their presence. Her pulse raced, and the walls of the room seemed to shift, the very foundations of the resort bending to some ancient, unseen force. The once familiar room had become a tomb, and she was the final piece, the final sacrifice, drawn into the twisted dance of the land's eternal hunger. Isabel stumbled back, her mind reeling, but her body refused to move as quickly as her thoughts. The shadows reached out, and though they were not entirely solid, their touch was cold, unnaturally cold. It felt as though the life itself was being siphoned out of her with every second they were near. The figures of the missing families surrounded her, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and resignation. They seemed to whisper no words, but feelings, memories. Their voices tangled with the winds of the cursed land. Claude stepped forward, his face contorted in pain. You don't understand. It's already too late. You've seen too much. There is no way out now. The land, it chooses. And you've been chosen." His voice was barely audible over the low, hollow hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. Isabel could hardly breathe. "Claude, please, I don't want to be part of this. I just wanted to understand what happened here. I just wanted to." Her words were choked off by a wave of dizziness that washed over her, and her knees buckled beneath her. She could feel her vision blurring, her senses becoming increasingly detached from reality. The shadows loomed closer, their icy grip tightening around her limbs, pulling her toward the center of the room where the ancient stone table awaited. Claude watched her struggle, his face twisted with what might have been remorse, but also fear for her and for himself. "There's nothing we can do," he whispered, his voice shaking. "The land will take what it's owed, no matter who it is, and once it's taken, it doesn't let go." Isabel's mind, clouded with panic, clung to the remnants of her thoughts. She had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. With every ounce of strength she could muster, she pushed against the shadows, her body trembling under their chilling touch, but it was futile. The shadows wrapped themselves around her, like chains of ice, tightening with each breath she took, and then, as the room seemed to close in on her, she felt it the unmistakable sensation of being pulled downward. The ground beneath her feet shifted, as if the earth itself had opened up, ready to swallow her whole. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her vision blurred further. She was no longer in control of her body, no longer in control of her fate. She was a part of the land now, a sacrifice in its eternal cycle of hunger, but in the moments before the darkness fully consumed her, Isabel heard something. A voice. Not one of the missing families, not one of the shadows. This voice was different. It was faint, like a whisper on the wind, and it was coming from somewhere far above her, beyond the forest, beyond the resort. "There is a way," the words were almost too faint to hear, but they carried a strange weight. There was something about them, something that resonated deep within her. A glimmer of hope, or was it simply a last, desperate cry from someone who had once stood where she was now? The voice faded, but the words remained with her, etched into her mind. There is a way. Her body, now entirely encased by the shadows, felt weightless as it was drawn deeper into the earth. The land had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before. But Isabel held on to those words, clinging to them like a lifeline in the depths of her terror. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe there was still hope. But for now, it was too late. The shadows enveloped her entirely, and the room, the world itself seemed to slip away. In the days that followed, the story of Isabel Hughes's disappearance became another tragic chapter in the dark history of Whispering Pines Resort. The authorities, once again, found nothing, no trace, no clues. Her cabin was left exactly as she had left it, her research and notes scattered on the table, as though she had vanished without a trace. The locals who had known her spoke in hushed tones, a mix of fear and resignation in their voices. Another soul claimed by the land, but the legend, the curse, the pact, whatever it was, remained. And Whispering Pines continued to stand, its doors open to new visitors, its dark secret buried beneath the surface. Families continued to come, unknowingly walking into the jaws of an ancient, unyielding hunger. And every so often, someone would disappear. Someone would be chosen, and the land would claim them too. The question, of course, was never whether it would happen again, but when. Time passed, and the whispers of Whispering Pines Resort faded into the background of the world's ever-changing narrative. The disappearances became little more than a ghost story, a dark footnote in the history of Willow Springs. Until the inevitable happened, another family came to visit. A family much like the others who had arrived with hope, only to disappear without a trace. This time, however, their visit would mark the end of the resort's long reign of terror. It was in 1998 when the Westbrook family, a father, mother, and their teenage daughter decided to spend their vacation at Whispering Pines. The Westbrooks had heard of the resort through glowing reviews, marketed as an idyllic escape from the noise of modern life. They were looking for peace, for quiet hikes and bonding in the great outdoors, all set against the backdrop of the resort's picturesque mountain landscape. To them, Whispering Pines promised an ideal getaway, a sanctuary far removed from the stresses of daily life. From the moment they arrived, the family felt an uneasy calm. Their cabin, though charming, seemed strangely secluded, nestled on the outskirts of the property, far from the main resort area. It was almost as if they had been placed at the very edge of the land, where it met the forest's darker edges. They noticed nothing overtly wrong, yet the subtle sense of being watched lingered in the back of their minds. On the third day of their stay, after returning from a hike, they found their cabin doors ajar, their belongings, luggage, shoes, and other personal items were left as if they had been abandoned in haste. The father, John Westbrook, immediately called out for his wife and daughter, but there was no answer. The silence that followed seemed to deepen the unease. His mind raced through possibilities. Had they gone for a walk, left in a rush, or was something more sinister at play? But then he noticed something even more chilling. The floorboards were wet-soaked. In fact, despite there having been no rain that day, as his eyes scanned the room, he saw the faint outlines of wet footprints leading toward the door, then vanishing into the woods. John hesitated only for a moment before following them. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved deeper into the forest, the path marked by those eerie, waterlogged footprints. It didn't take long for him to realize that the footprints were not those of his family. They were too large, too unfamiliar. The deeper he ventured into the woods, the more surreal the scene became. The trees, towering and ancient, seemed to bend and sway in the wind. But it was as though they were not part of nature. Something about them felt alive, sentient, as if they were aware of his every movement. He passed an old stone circle, partially overgrown with vines. That seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't place why. As the hours stretched on, John's hope of finding his family began to fade, replaced with the creeping sense that he was walking deeper into something ancient, something much older than the resort itself. The footprints led him to a clearing, where, in the centre, he saw something truly bizarre, a circle of stone slabs, their surfaces worn and weathered by time. At the centre of the circle was a stone altar, stained with something dark. It was then that John understood the truth. This was no ordinary resort. This was a place that had been built on the bones of something far more ancient, something that had long demanded tribute. It wasn't until he heard the whispering soft, almost imperceptible, like a breeze through the trees, that he realized he was not alone. He turned, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling around him, tugging at his sanity. And then, at that moment, he saw them, the missing families, their forms barely discernible but unmistakable, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at him with an expression that conveyed both horror and sorrow. They were trapped, forever bound to the land, their souls prisoners of the ancient pact. John tried to run, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling at his feet, as if the earth itself was fighting to keep him there. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and then he heard a voice, a single voice rising above the rest. It was the voice of his daughter. "Daddy, help! It was all John could hear before the forest closed in around him. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the land. The trees bent toward him, their branches stretching out like hands ready to drag him into the abyss. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the faint outline of his daughter's face, pale and hollow, her eyes pleading for him to come closer. The authorities were once again called in, but they found nothing. The Westbrooks were gone, and there was no trace of them, no footprints, no signs of struggle, just the echoing emptiness of the land. The cabin, untouched and undisturbed, stood as if nothing had happened. Whispering Pines Resort continued its quiet existence, its dark secret safely buried beneath the weight of its history. But the land, it seemed, had finally grown tired of its secret being uncovered. The few remaining residents of Willow Springs whispered that something had changed. The whispers in the woods had become louder, more insistent, as though the land was calling out, waiting for the next family to answer its call. And as for the resort, it remained open to visitors, though fewer came, drawn by rumours that turned to legends and then to myth. Some say the land is no longer content with taking just 1 or 2 families every few years. Some say it now demands more, a greater tribute to sate its eternal hunger. The truth, like the whispers in the pines, remains hidden, shrouded in darkness. For now, Whispering Pines Resort stands abandoned, yet alive. It waits, ever patient, for the next unwitting souls who will unknowingly walk into its grasp. But it's only a matter of time before another family arrives, and the land will claim them too. The story of Whispering Pines is a story like so many others, one of quiet horror. A place that once seemed idyllic, now forever tainted by its past. As the years go by, the memory of what transpired there begins to fade, yet the land remains. It is timeless, patient, waiting for the next souls to wander into its grasp. But as we close the pages of this story, remember, some places are more than just physical locations. They are steeped in history, in ancient rites, and in the silence of those who were taken, Whispering Pines is no exception. Its beauty, its peaceful facade, only hides the darkness beneath. And though the resort may stand empty now, its legacy continues to live on, trapped within the very earth that birthed it. And so, dear listener, as we fade into the quiet of the night, let the echoes of the pines be a reminder that sometimes the land we walk on holds secrets we can never escape. Now, dim the lights. Let the soft hum of the wind carry you into your dreams. Be at peace, but never forget there are places that will never let you go.